Welcome once again to Arctic Fire. This unique gathering of swordsmiths explores the outer edge of the craft, where craftsmanship, artistry, storytelling, history, and myth combine. This year, the group has recreated objects found in the legendary Hoard of Grendel, from the most ancient surviving poem in Old English, Beowulf. 4 days of live broadcast, in which legends will be reborn. Arctic Fire 2016, Grendel's Hoard.
I think one of the places we should probably start is just what is Beowulf? And probably Peter, you're probably a great person to launch that for us.
I can start out at least, and I hope the rest of you chime in. Well, Beowulf, the poem of Beowulf, the heroic story, has come down to us as the earliest written manuscript in Old English. So it is often understood in an Anglo-Saxon context, but the story itself more than suggests that it's originally a poem of oral tradition that describes pre-Christian Scandinavia. And you have landscapes and persons who are verifiable. This is a poem describing real areas, real places, and there are people who are historic personas, some of the earliest ones, that are also occurring in other sources. So those who heard this poem being recited would recognize themselves. That this is a world we know. These are things that we already heard about, that connect to other stories, to other legends, to other rumors, and things that, perhaps you had a relative or a grandfather who was involved in these things. So it is, just because of that, a uniquely engaging poem. But added to that is the elements that are uniquely for the Beowulf poem, which is the hero Beowulf, who is described again as belonging to clans, tribes of this area, and his heroic deeds that are anything but everyday-like. He is a Superman of his time. He can do anything, and he's not shy about telling about this. And it's a story that involves several adventures and a lot of epic climaxes like that. But the one that is perhaps most famous is his interaction with the monster, the troll, the creature, the whatever, Grendel, and what comes out of that.
Yeah, so there is, the idea of the troll. What's interesting is this was a story, like you said, they mix fact and fiction. That wasn't unusual in this time. There wasn't a non-fiction and a fiction section in Barnes and Noble. It was you have real events and real people, and then these these extrapolations, the hyperbole of sitting around the fire, and so it's such an interesting time where myth and legend and reality merge together, and I think that really speaks to kind of what we do.
And the story itself is something that it has these elements from the period that it was written down, which is this kind of freezing of a time period. So it's this window into this place where the story was written down. But the story that was written down was building on an older story that was probably told over and over and over again around fires and in meat halls. And that story is built out of stories that are really ancient. So there are elements in the story that go back to probably back into the Bronze Age. And there are these cool things that when you look into storytelling and myth, there are these things called mythemes that are an irreducible piece of myth. So that you can mytheme. It's like a meme,
like about a meme about a myth.
Yeah, mytheme. Or it's the same thing as in language, in linguistics when they talk about the
interesting
phonemes, right? But you can find these little pieces of myth that are ways of kind of tracing back a story and finding other stories that are parallel that have the same similar pieces that give you a sense that there was something earlier that it's drawn.
So in a way you can say that even like the factual part of it, the landscapes, the persons, the historical events that the poem Beowulf suggests to are known before and are well known, but also the fantastic elements are known as being the wow part, the fantastic part of reality. So it's a reality enhancing element. You recognize yourself in this storyline. You know sort of what's going to happen next because it's ingrained in this kind of story. But it happens to these people at this place. And I think it helps to make it even more engaging, and you can visualize these events because you've heard sort of things about it before.
It's also a political thing, like establishing dynasties.
Yes.
Saying he was our first king because he fight with the dragon and stuff like that. He is coming from Odin, so it's like a political statement that that's why they rule us. So that might be a reason why like the ruling class was interested in circulating those.
And it's an actual function of the story at the time when the poem was told and written down, is that it's this story that you can use as a kind of essentially propaganda to establish the reason that there's an elite in society and why they have the right to have nice things where everybody else maybe doesn't have, lives in a little hut or whatever.
And the nice things have a crucial role in the story.
Yeah, true.
They're not just embellishments, they become almost characters of their own right in the story. Some of them have legendary status being handed down through generations. They are well-known jewels, well-known weapons, things that have like their own character and their own sort of fame.
And ancient is very important in this because in this Germanic tradition there is a fascination of ancient, equaling quality.
Yes.
Because this is a culture which is very looking into the past for its golden age.
Well, and they knew that there was this golden age of the Roman Empire. They very consciously knew. It's like they were living in a post-apocalyptic world.
They were.
Right? It was like Mad Max for them because they knew how amazing Rome had been and that the ancient world had been so rich.
There's one section when Beowulf, just in the beginning, when he comes with his warband to the hall Herod, it's mentioned that they're walking on a paved road.
Right.
These kind of roads are not made anymore.
Right.
And there is a place in Denmark with a very ancient road. It's still there. More than, it's 1500 years after the poem was composed.
Yeah.
And it's still there for us to walk on, and it was ancient at the time when the poem was recited. So they did know how to make these kind of roads, and we don't make them today. So it's definitely like an after the glorious days kind of thing.
But not
that also
that
explains-
long after it.
No,
It's still like, it's just like if there had been a society like this, but it was 200 years ago, and now we're in a society like the kind of 1300s. But we know that there was a society where there were, people had heated floors in their houses, and and if you go to the Museum of London, we were in the Museum of London, and they have these, they have a reconstruction of a Roman villa from Roman Britain, and it's like it's extremely similar to
What we have now.
but it's almost identical to the 1700s.
Yeah.
It's basically like that's the level of society. They had heated floors. They had an entire servant class who worked inside the house, like doing things for kind of wealthy families who were essentially middle class.
Exactly, a middle class.
They had a middle class. People were literate. They were, and that entire society collapsed and was replaced by a society that was almost identical to the society that existed before the Romans came into Northern Europe and Britain. Which
I think about it as like alien abduction, that you are like taken from like really primitive thing, and you are coming to Rome and you are seeing like marble statues and white buildings, and you are drinking wine and stuff like that. It must be really
extremely exotic things. Yes.
So that's sort of a historical context and a little bit of kind of a position of where Beowulf was and the flavor of it. So what about some of the specifics of
But what happens?
Yeah, what happens? I mean, the note of 2016 is Grendel's Hoard, so perhaps we should talk about that a bit.
Well, the most important thing to know if you don't want to go read Beowulf, and it's a great read, and just go to the Wikipedia page too if you want to understand the context of Beowulf. But in very simple terms, there is a problem in this mead hall, which is basically a bar or a big gathering place where everybody gets, they were big on getting drunk together. And so the warriors got together, got drunk every night, and this monster, this troll named Grendel, would come in and kill the warriors as they slept. And Beowulf comes in, the hero, and he says, I can take care of this. And he's challenged by this one jerk named Unferth and so on. But then that night, he goes to sleep, and Grendel comes in, and they have this epic battle in which Beowulf, and there's this thing earlier where it says no weapon will bite the skin of Grendel, where he's supposed to have like these scales or something for his skin. So Beowulf just chooses not to fight him with a weapon. So they wrestle around, and Beowulf is so strong that he rips Grendel's arm off, and Grendel runs dying and bleeding out into the night. And then there's this big, what happens next?
Well, they have a big celebration. It's like, yeah, you killed Grendel, good job.
Nailing the arm of the door.
I did a great job. I'm pretty pleased with myself. And he's like boasting about how he killed all the times that I defeated people was amazing as well. And then,
So like in modern times, you know how like someone does something heroic, and the reporter always asks the student, do you consider yourself a hero? And nobody ever looks, well, hell yeah, I think of myself as a hero. No, it's like, no, this year, like, that's not the way they were back then.
no, Beowulf's like, hero, my dear. And then, so what happens is they kind of, a few days pass, or some time passes, and everybody thinks everything's good. And then in the night, this terrible monster comes into the mead hall, and Beowulf has been given his own quarters at this time. He's not in the mead hall, and takes the old advisor, and she drags him off into the night and kills him. And they wake up in the morning, and he's the advisor that the king relies on the most. So he's an old man instead of a warrior.
Which I think a warrior with him in a shield wall before.
Yeah,
He's an old warrior, but now an advisor.
so she drags him off, and
And
they're
this
like,
she is not just any new kind of monster.
No.
Not a wandering monster in the
it's
rulebook.
Grendel's mother coming back for
yes.
revenge.
Yes.
Yeah. So they go. So then they go and they decide to go after her, and they ask the rustic people out in the hills questions, and they tell them that there's a lake high up in the mountains where that are haunted by wolves. And in that lake, they think that's where trolls were reputed to live. And then they make this procession where they have all of the people in the court, the king, Beowulf, and Unferth, and everybody goes on this procession to the lake for Beowulf to go and kill the mother.
Right.
And I think it's really interesting because it's actually, it looks exactly like the description of what would happen when you're making a lake offering, which is in Germanic society and Celtic society, they would make these amazing objects, like the things that we've made here that are with a lot of craft and gold and silver, and they would take them and they would put them in the lake. They would offer them to lakes as this kind of a propitiation or a symbol of their wealth, that they can give this away, but to the kind of feminine lake spirit, which is what's happening here, except for it's this weird inversion where he's going down into the lake to kill the female lake spirit.
And then
It's almost like Beowulf is the offering in a way.
Yeah. So he goes down there and he fights with the mother. He can't kill her. There's a Hoard, and we'll get into we'll be talking about the specifics of those stories in our different presentations.
Right.
But there's a Hoard, and Beowulf takes some of it back.
And so here's the thing. Treasure and plunder is such a big part of this era, and it's a way of showing your success in battles and so on. And so it says in the poem that something to the effect of many treasures did the king of the Prince of the Geats, which is like Beowulf, see, but he chose to take none of them. So there's always been a question, like, why didn't he take anything that was down there? What was in that hoard of treasures that was in Grendel's hoard after he killed the mother? And that was the question that we sort of started playing with. What would have been in there?
Yes.
There's some things we know. There's one thing we know that was in there. There's other objects we knew would have been in the lair based on what you hear in the poem, but there's other things that you can extrapolate what we know about Grendel and what we can imagine that might have been in the Hoard. And then there's, very intriguingly, after you start looking into this, and Peter's going to cover this a lot in his presentation, after you start looking into it, you find out there is a lot more evidence out there about what may have actually historically existed, but I won't steal your thunder.
Yeah, and one thing that, I mean, we live in a material society, so treasure is part of our reality, treasure in a sort of projected meaning. But, I mean, imagine this is a time where normal people, they just don't have fancy stuff. They have tools of their trade, they have what they need for survival, and most of these things are stuff they just make themselves what they need. And some objects, they need some kind of specialist part of, and you need to go to the village smith. But the village smith is not the guy who can make these fabulous objects that are significant for the elite. So treasure, war gear, it's not just good stuff. It's on a different level altogether, because it's what is given to you by the ruler, or it's taken as loot. And owning these things is intimately connected to being part of the elite of the society. So it's not just that it's valuable; it's significant on a different level. So the gift economy and the exchange of gifts is also showing that you are the kind of person who can own one of these things. And this is quite important. It's not just you're given a nice thing that you can buy stuff for, because it's not like that. Because there's a different kind of economy. You know, you don't exchange a fabulous sword for a few liters of milk. It's not part of that kind of economy.
Well, and that's how you have warriors. Like in the kind of, this is essentially a tribal society, and the way that chieftains would have warriors is by giving them gifts.
It's the most important quality in a leader. In Germanic culture, you know, you would think that it would be being the mightiest warrior, which you should be. You would think maybe it would be the wisest, but really the most valued quality, which I think would be a wonderful thing to revive, is generosity. You know, so
It's on the first page on Beowulf that young leaders should give gifts to his warriors.
Right, the ring giver, gold rings.
And one of the things that's interesting, just to give context to the society that this is happening in, when they've looked at, once they started writing down inventories of things that people had, so this is actually later, but it actually refers to the kind of society that this was earlier, they would pass on things like the knife that you had for eating. Like we have like a big drawer full of knives and forks, right? And you probably bought it yourself when you like. But back then they would pass on their eating utensils from generation to generation, because you didn't get a new thing. You had the old thing and you passed it on to your children, and they had it, because it was so difficult to acquire material culture. So that means that the material culture has a really profound value.
And it's also the fact that a piece that is handed down also somehow acquires value, because it has passed through hands, and it gets more and more of a story to tell.
Right.
So it's not like a used piece that is old and worn. It's a thing that takes on some quality of its previous owners. It becomes more and more a narrative object, and because of that, it increases its value.
And it gives the owner legitimacy to
Yes.
especially when you're talking about objects that are power objects like swords and things. It has ancestral value.
I think it's really important to understand this story, and the stories we're telling about the objects we made, is that the objects have personalities, and they've got, through their interaction, they can be good things to have, bad things to have, or have special characteristics about them. There was a personification of these things.
They do interact with fate.
Yes.
They give you it's a key that slots into unlocking potentials of fate, because you become part of a group, you become part of a destiny by being elevated or chosen to be a certain kind of person. And again, the gift economy, the ruler is elevated by the richness of his gifts. The richer things he can give, the more awesome he is. And think about that when you see offerings in lakes. So if you have these fantastic things that you conquered in battle by defeating an army, what do? You throw it all in a lake.
The weapons.
The weapons of the defeat of the vanquished enemy.
Very common.
You chop them up, you bend them, you destroy them, just to show that I am so big that I just give this to the powers of destiny. I throw it down into the lake, which is the mirror, which on the other side you have the other powers.
Right.
And often a female deity.
Yes.
Usually, like these people had bigger ideas. In the pre-Christian period, they had there were big deities like Odin or Woden, and there were deities that kind of transcended tribes. But each tribe had kind of tutelary deities of waterways and of ancestral deities, like ancestors that were really important. And so when they were giving offerings to water, they were often it would be like a female figure that was in the water that they thought they were giving these offerings to for whatever reason.
And this is good as well because it also attaches to this. We have this obsession of clear definitions. Like, okay, Grendel is a troll, his mother is a monster.
Right.
But in the poem, it's much more sort of uncertain. They are even somehow described as troll-like. Mm-hmm. Grendel is he is an outlaw. He is cast out, and saying that is also saying that he might have belonged.
Well, that's what makes the whole idea of making a lot of these objects meaningful to me is the idea that they might say something about this quality of Grendel as an outsider and as a tragic figure in some ways. I mean, there's always this tension about who is right and who is wrong, which isn't exactly the right way to put it, but in Germanic stories talking about warriors fighting each other, or feuds and sagas, so you can kind of see each side has a point. So the tragedy becomes the fact that they're killing each other off,
Beowulf isn't that.
And Grendel actually has that sympathy in the poem. There is some sympathy for him. Which to me became a really important part of seeing some of these objects. Why does he have them down there?
Yeah. And when the fierceness and terrible nature of Grendel's mother is described, I'm not good with words, but I've seen it and heard it said that the words that are used to describe her fierceness and terrifying nature in these extreme acts of violence are the same words that are used to describe Beowulf when he is aggressive.
Yeah.
So it's not like modern storytelling when you first show the hero suffering and by that making the revenge sort of okay. This is not at all that kind of story.
He's not entirely good.
No. They are both terrifying in their aspect of fierceness and violence. And there's no more to say about it.
There's much more ambiguity.
Yes, absolutely. And
But not for them, I suppose, because it was a tribalistic society. If you didn't belong, you didn't, you weren't worthy.
But from a reader of the poem from the outside looking in, it seems more ambiguous.
And this opens up this fascinating possibility of who is Grendel and who is Grendel's mother. They are troll-like. Are they thirsty? Thirst is the Norse word for a giant or a troll or someone who is extremely mighty, perhaps.
But sometimes
and this is like a gliding scale.
They'll be like, sometimes isn't there a Scandinavian name for like dragonflies? It's like a thursteed.
Oh, I've never heard that.
Like there are these, so they're shifting their position, like, and even in just general European mythology, like we were talking about Culhwch Olwen, where her father is a giant, but you never question that she's a human, like even though her father's a giant.
Or maybe she's a giantess. I mean, many of the Norse gods, even though they're sort of their sworn enemies, their natural enemies at least, are the giants, the Thursi.
Right.
And they are going to face armies or forces from these clans, the Thursi, at Ragnarök. Still, many of them are married to giantesses. And they are as mighty and powerful and awesome as the gods. And that's why they are also sort of the ultimate enemy because they are as powerful or more than you are. And sometimes it's because they are so extremely unimaginably huge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like when, is it Loki and Thor who goes to...
Utgard.
and on the way they get tired and they need to sleep somewhere in a cave, and it turns out the cave is the mitten of this giant they're going to face.
Yeah.
So there is this,
But later on, they hang out with them and are drinking.
exactly
And they're like the same size.
at the same table.
Right.
So this wonderful sort of sliding and gliding.
It's a shift into another world where
Yes.
dimensional, the dimensional size of these things is not necessarily the question. We talk about it that way, but it could also indicate primordial nature or a depth of being or an ancient quality. I mean, the giants are older than the gods. The first being.
And also mightier.
But then after that, it's gone.
Yeah. And maybe it's also somehow a connection to the experience of the might of the Roman Empire. The hugeness of it, the
Right.
imaginable complexity and magic of it.
Right.
And you come back from your service beyond the Limes, and you come back home and you talk about these fantastic things. And the only way you can describe it is that there are these. I mean, emperor is a god. So you walked among gods. These are giants of people. They do impossible things. They can construct the most fabulous pieces of stone. And you come back home and the most fantastic buildings, they are built by oak logs. Like Hoard.
Yeah.
And there's gold inside, and it's incredible, but it's a
even-
hole that can be burned.
But even when you look at, like, I was looking at the construction methods for these beautiful Viking Age chests, and they're beautiful. They're all covered in ornamentation, and they have gold foil fittings. But when you actually look at the construction method, it's just a whole bunch of stuff that's tacked onto a little wooden box. So there's no actually, like, the internal structure of the thing is just this. It's just a wooden box with a bunch of stuff nailed to it. So it's this kind of very primitive society with really beautiful material culture, but it doesn't have the kind of technology that the Romans had. So if you were in Rome and you came back and tried to describe these immense buildings and stuff, you would have no way of knowing how they were built. So you'd be like, well, I guess the giants probably built them, or you know what I mean?
I mean, look at any of the Parthenon, any of like these amazing Roman or Greek buildings, and you can't. This Germanic mindset would have a very hard time understanding.
And also back home, you have the standing stones.
Of course,
you have the Neolithic graves with stones that are quite impressive size, actually. And these are the tombs of the ancients, or maybe the homes of dwarves and giants and trolls or whatever. And as some of you have said already, these otherworldly creatures can be understood as the ancients, the forefathers,
the ancestors,
those who sort of were before. And again, this feeling of diminishing of knowledge, the shrinking of the world. And there is this really interesting aspect of the Beowulf poem, recent research by Hoard, who has looked at this poem from an archaeological perspective. He carefully looked at the objects described and comparing those to the archaeological record, and says that these type of objects, the solid gold that's very frequently described, it is common in the fine material up to the mid 6th century. And then they sort of disappear. And there is the period in just predating that, when you have the great offerings of gold bracteates and these very rich gold colors and these gold rings. And it seems like it was a fashion to really go overboard with extremely lavish offerings.
Right.
And there is this really interesting observation that the decade of the 530s and up into the beginning of the 540s, there are in the polar ice and pollen analysis, different kinds of analysis of material indicate that there are 3 massive volcanic eruptions.
And that's right around the time that the Western Roman Empire
Meteor strikes. There's a theory about a meteor strike.
And you have in Scandinavia, you have villages that are they are just abandoned. And pollen analysis shows that fields are growing into forest. And this is not just one place, it's dotted all over the place. And this suggests a very dramatic decrease in population, which suggests
What's what prompted
famine,
it?
widespread famine. There are Roman historians from this time period who describes that the sun is not visible. It's hidden behind, like a dusk, behind a veil.
Right. The
That
dark ages
what, for
are
1
actually-
year and 1 year and a half, there is no proper spring and summer. So it's put forward that this might actually be what we see described as the end of the world, Ragnarök, is predated. It's sort of the coming of Ragnarök is 2 years of full winter.
And that's when
And maybe this is actually what happened. Maybe this is what is described. I mean, what happened in the end of the first half of the 6th century was an unimaginable famine,
Right.
and possibly combined with pestilence. And so you have like a devastation.
Trolls might be cannibals.
Yes, and you have people, they don't survive, they have to move, or they die a most horrific death. And you can imagine those who do live in the halls, there are people stalking outside. You may even understand the description of Grendel as you can't defeat him, we can't kill him with swords, and he sneaks up on you and he eats you. You know, maybe this is starvation, maybe this is famine coming and creeping at you. You build the most fabulous hall, but you can't hold any feasts there.
But I think this is what, I mean, you can see this is really rich ground that we're working in here. There's lots of gaps in the myth that we can put a lot of questions to, and interesting speculation, and then manifest these ideas that we have about these gaps in the myth and the objects that we make.
I think one of the things I would like to do is we talked about halls and these meeting halls. And Peter, you've spoken about the mead hall, and the hall is sort of a metaphor in some ways. And this kind of gets back to the question that you had at the very beginning: is the sort of meeting play a metaphor for sort of getting this group together to work together?
Yeah, I think that the mead hall is important space to meet and celebrate and judge and stuff like that. But it's also a symbol of order against chaos, because this society is like surrounded by danger, hunger, hostility, and you have to stick together. You have to stick to the code, obey your ruler. You have to be part of the society, which makes Grendel's outcastness like really severe punishment. So, and if you are able to survive that being outlawed, you are really dangerous, because most of the outlaws would just die. It was a severe punishment. So, but also mead hall as a place where stories takes place. It's important, and I think that we should say that this is not a scientific project. This is artistic project.
Yeah.
And we may be knowledgeable about the period. We may use knowledge and science to inform our art. But the thing is that we are in the mead hall of our brains. We are recreating the story as we see it. Because if you are a history geek, and if you are watching Arctic Fire, you probably may be. You have some idea how material culture looked in certain period, but it was not common in the past. So if you were told the story of Beowulf, you would possibly imagine to be contemporary with the art styles, and you would see it differently than the people who were told the story 100 years before you.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the metaphor of like individual approaches of us. All of us see the story differently, and we fill the gaps differently. But and it's coming back to the first question, really. How do we work together cohesively? We work together cohesively because we respect each other, we are inspiring each other, and I think that's like the most beautiful part of this gathering, the mutual respect.
Well, so what might be interesting is to have each of you just talk to that just a little bit. I mean, the notion of working together collectively to build this Hoard, and then the other part of it, of course, is you each chose something to build, And why did you choose what you chose to build?
Sure. Well, to speak to the first thing and to follow up on the mead hall discussion, one of my favorite things about this project is that it coalesced and we really decided that this is what we were going to do and fleshed out most of the details together in Uppsala, which is probably the very same place from which Beowulf came to go to Hoard and fight Grendel. And it was the religious center of Sweden and political center of Sweden. And there's a little restaurant that serves mead. So we were actually sitting in that mead hall when we started this project.
And it's called Odin's. It's like a romantic,
It's
19th century.
It's Victorian.
Yeah.
It's famous Victorian. It's like this.
And yet it does.
It's so wonderful. Well, as far as speaking of the first part of it, working together, as Petar said, we really respect each other. We really inspire each other. I feel greatly inspired by all of you, and it's just wonderful to have that inspiration, but also that camaraderie, which is like a war band in many ways, which is really great. I don't know as that I would have pushed myself to make a project like this if I wasn't terribly afraid of letting you all down.
There is that.
Yeah. So what I decided to make was inspired by this idea of what motivates Grendel. And it specifically says that one of the things Grendel hates is the sound of the joy in the hall, because the hall is a joyful place. And specifically it mentions the music that's being played. And we have several musical instruments from that era that we know of. There's panpipes, there's bone flutes, and there's this lyre, which again is a thing that harkens back to the ancient world. But the lyre is also the instrument that these stories are told with. They're accompanied, like Beowulf could very easily have been told with one of these instruments. So for me, that was this moment. I've always been fascinated with these lyres. I've made one before, and I said, I know it's not a sword, and I know it's more wood than metal, but this is what I want to do because it really encapsulates this aspect of it for me. And I'm really attracted to the notion that it's one of the objects Grendel just snatched, took back, and dragged down underwater, and just smashed.
Tried to play it.
Maybe just shoot this thing, but I wait not it. Yeah, because he would have wanted to. He would have also longed for it.
Yes.
As in addition to hating it.
Yes.
It's a thing you can't have as an outcast.
Yeah, precisely. It's a very nice thing to do.
Yes.
That's awesome. So maybe we roll around you, Dave, and then roll around.
Sure, yeah. You'll notice that my presentation, if you look on the schedule, is called The Sword That Failed. And there is a sword that fails in the poem. And there's an interesting backstory to it. And I'm fascinated by the idea of swords having personalities, of swords having intention and intentionality, and being influenced by previous owners and the construction of the sword. And this was a very interesting sword. I wanted I wanted to make a cursed. It's one of those checklists. I always want to make a cursed sword. And we don't know if this particular sword is cursed, but there's some evidence in the text to suggest that it might be. And so it was sort of interesting to come up with a design that would radiate, but also be consistent with the description of the sword in the text, but also radiate a sort of malice and backstabbing quality. So that's why I was interested in doing it.
Awesome. Peter?
Well, approaching this story is really, you have this sense that, just like when you read a poem, it's easy to see things between the lines, and there's a lot of things suggestive, and it's really sparking your associations. And I really like the fact that the Hoard is like a self-portrait of Grendel. He took these things because he coveted them, because he wanted them, and it made his pain even greater because it didn't make him less excluded, and that's just a fantastic thing when you dwell on it. And there is this story, the ever-present horrific brutality, and also the duality of it. It's not a simple story of heroism. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And then that figure of Grendel's mother, who might be some kind of Valkyria, who is sent out to now collect this hero, you know?
Valkyrie, yeah.
Yeah, because those, when you read how Valkyries are described, they can be seen in dream as the most nightmarish creatures. They can drive you insane from just the terror of them. And there are also these dreamlike women of unimaginable beauty at the same time. And they enter into the life of heroes in a very, very decisive manner. Sometimes it's, taken up to Valhalla. Sometimes, like in the story of Völund, he actually, he has a relationship to one of them. And it's been pointed out by people who studied this text that the way Grendel's mother is portrayed is that, yes, she is terrifying, she's terrible, but it's in her aspect of raging mother, it's in the aspect of revengeful, vengeful, hateful, and the fact that it's a female who poses this thread to this extremely masculine hero, that's just a fascinating dynamic and image when you place it in this world. So that scene of their meeting, when he braves the waters and fights all those sea monsters and finally meets is confronted with Grendel's mother, that was to me very climactic. So I was interested in looking into that dagger, and this turned out to be the perfect rabbit hole, because starting to scratch the surface of that story, things fell in place and revealed. Sometimes when you start to pull in a thread, you are surprised that reality is so much more incredible than the myth. And this is something I'm going to talk more about in my next presentation, which is about the work with this dagger and what was revealed to me during that process.
Which is the next presentation. That's the one that's coming up.
That's at 2 o'clock.
2 o'clock.
Yes.
2 o'clock Alaska time.
Yes, and it's soon approaching.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, Jake and Owen collaborated on something, I think largely, right? On something that's so massive it has perhaps its own gravity. Take it away.
So I guess we've constructed the sort of giants. When Grendel goes down, or when Beowulf goes down into the lair of Grendel and his mother, and he meets Grendel's mother and fights her, he has the sword that doesn't work. He can't cut her with it, and she's stabbing him, and he looks over on the wall, and there's a sword that was forged by giants, 4 giants, and the only person who is strong enough to be able to use it is Beowulf, and he takes that sword down from the wall and kills Grendel's mother with it, and then cuts off Grendel's head, and then he swims back with Grendel's head and the hilt of the sword. But after he cuts off Grendel's head, the blade of the sword actually completely dissolves from the acidic blood of the trolls. So there's actually once he comes out, there's no blade left. But we have this suggestion of what the blade must have been. So we decided to actually build the blade as it would have been hanging on the wall. For me, the sword of giants is something I'm really fascinated with, the more ancient aspects of mythology and how it connects to early stories about otherness and the human relationship to the unknown. And so this is a sword that really is a sword of the ancestors.
Yeah.
And giants often represent ancestors. So I that was just really excited to build it. And also, I was really excited to work with Owen on it. I really like Owen. And I thought it would be really fun to do a collaboration.
I wanted to explore the physical realities of a giant sword.
Yeah.
From the point of view of it being a hero piece that only a hero could use. Because I've experimented with and failed to make objects of this scale before because I bring them back to my human scale.
Yes.
So just trying to create something that would be both historically formed from an idea of what we thought giants were and their ideas, and then just a massive, great big sword.
It is truly massive.
That nobody that wasn't Beowulf could lift.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. He could do
Some of
it.
us
Yeah,
tried to
we
do
can't.
that.
He must have been the big lad. I think he had a really good manifested ego.
I don't think my ego's manifested. It's not at all.
So, Petter, I know you've made a few things actually.
Yeah, I decided to make few things because what I wanted to explore is like objects representing collective nature of the Spear Danes, to somehow define what is Grand Outlaw from. So I made several objects. I will talk about them in my presentation, but most of them are somehow connected to the tribe of the Spear Danes, who are not the hero of they are not protagonists, not the antagonist of the story, but they are very important because they are providing context for the story. And this is really something which I really like about collaborations, and especially collaboration like this that creates multiple objects, that we are providing context for each other. So our pieces are unique, but they are also part of the context, which is not possible or easy to do if you work alone. So that's I have objects that represent the collective nature of the thing, but also are influenced by the collective nature of collaboration, which I really like.
So, we have a few minutes left. I've received a few questions online. Several of them are about asking to have the lyre played, which I think...
That's going to be the
Yeah, exactly. So-
I think we need to let that hang for a little.
Okay, a little suspense. We'll build some suspense.
Yes. Please check back in later. It will be played.
There were some questions early on about how you decided to build what you build. I think we've kind of addressed that, and probably have an opportunity to do that a little bit more in your presentations. Really interesting question, kind of a philosophical one. Quote, you guys have mentioned the other, quote, rather, the other, and otherness several times. Can you explain that a bit?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, Peter, you've got a smile on your face. Do you want
Well, we have addressed it a bit with the idea of being outside the tribe, and if you're outcast, you die.
Yeah, there is that. There is that. But at least, I mean, for me, and this is from a purely personal and contemporary perspective.
Yeah.
The other is like those creatures, those manifestations you meet in a dream, that may be enigmatic or threatening, but clearly you can't fully understand them. And yet they are also clearly part of yourself, because it's your dream after all.
Right.
And this is a function of the human mind that I think we also project when we are fully awake. Because the world around us are also part of us, but some aspects of it we choose to say, well, that's the other, that's the other part. We define ourselves by saying, that's not me. And that is a very interesting process, because it doesn't have, that dividing line doesn't have to be there. That dividing line truly defines us, that defines me. What I say is not me. That also says what I am.
Boundaries, yeah.
So that is the basis, the fundamental basis for conflict, because the other is not the one you talk to. the other one possibly negotiate with, but there is always this inherent conflict with the other. So it's really interesting where you draw that line from where the other is. And it's also inherent in this sort of process that the other will have aspects of you that you are uncomfortable with, that you're not willing to deal with, but that are still part of you. But you should project them to that other.
But there's also, I think, in ancient societies that have an element of shamanism, like these tribal societies, and also in societies where you have artists, you actually have people in the society who other themselves in order to be able to and this is what storytellers do. You become an other. You set yourself a little bit outside of the society so that you can observe it and then tell about it to the society. Right. So you have like a pet other, and that's kind of how I view myself as a creator. You go into the strangeness, you're kind of looking for the strange things, and then creating things from that place, trying to bring artifacts back from the other place that is this this perspective that you gain by setting yourself outside of society. And that's what like shape-shifting, and like the shamans will like shape-shift into like becoming a crow and seeing the society, and then they're able to maybe like, you know, help heal the society by having changed into something that was other. And I think that, so I think there's this really interesting element of otherness that is about, like you say, it actually defines society. And so in the poem, Grendel represents the other who, when you look at the story of Grendel and his mother, those elements of the story are the most telling about what the society is. And it reflects the society that is no more, which is the society of offerings to lakes and worshipping female deities, because now this is actually a Christian tale.
Yes. Yeah.
And it also reflects the society that is, which is that these things are, these are the other, and they're also reflecting the warrior society.
A follow-on question that just came on, specifically just what you addressed, how does the other apply specifically to the Beowulf or Grendel's Hoard?
Right.
And it's Grendel is clearly recognized as a symbolic representation of the other. I mean, even the Christians that wrote down the oral poem and put the overlay of the Christian myth on top of it, said that he was a descendant of the people of Cain. You know, and we all know that Cain, of course, was outcast from Eden, and so the other in that sense is represented as outside of God's love, and so the ultimate other, and the mark of Cain is upon him, and so on. So this, he is, you know, he's truly the other that's outside. And so in relation to Grendel's Hoard, one of the things we thought is that imagine if you are you are the other, you are outcast, and like Yule said, you want to be not the other anymore, and you want to experience things like love and the experience of beauty and music, but you are incapable of doing so, either going with the Christian version because you are cursed from God's love and therefore don't have the grace to experience that, or with these other older versions of it. So imagine, like, you know, having no taste buds, but, you know, going out and grabbing out the greatest delicacies you could, but being unable to taste it. You know, or imagine, this is a lame example, but I remember watching a superhero movie which was Captain America, and he says they're drinking, but his metabolism is such he can't get drunk, you know. And so yeah, some of these items represent what Grendel might have longed for, to experience what it feels like to be a human, to experience the humanity of culture and the tribe and the mead hall and the warmth of being a true human that he's outside of.
That same drinking competition went on between Legolas and Gilner, right, in the mead hall.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you have something you were going to throw in there? Or?
Well, it was actually when we were talking about other, and you were talking about the role of the artist as other.
Yeah.
I was going to say that I think one reason that we may all identify a lot with that is that even, and especially in ancient times, the smith was what was considered a liminal, you know, like to put it in modern kind of like folkloric context, a liminal figure that walks in both worlds. And is at once capable of a lot of power and respect, but also reviled because you're dirty and you're clearly a working man, and you're not going to be a great noble warrior. You're not going to fall into this upper third of, this tripartite worldview. You're working class, but yet the ruling class really needs you.
And you may also be associated with, because you may also be associated with forces that are supernatural and evil.
Of course, yes.
Which is
yes.
the other thing about Smiths,
Right.
is that they're making, they understand. They understand technology that nobody else in the
Right.
society understands, and it's viewed as magic.
And guarded as a secret because it's very valuable.
And they would encourage
Yeah.
people to think it was magical. So they
Right, and you
Well,
can,
it was
you can
magical.
make or break.
Magical explanations are a way to explain reality. It's we live in a post-scientific awareness society. Well, it's sort of slipping into the opposite again, but we have scientific explanations that we see as quite apart from myth, religion, but that was not the case.
But if something's so above you can't understand it, it becomes magic.
Right.
And
Which
it's-
is why I am absolutely convinced still that these guys actually do magic, because I don't understand that.
It's quite telling when you see the old Norse stories about the crafting of these objects, that those who made them, they're quite often dwarves. Or you have the cursed smith Beowulf, who is also
is an elf.
yeah. So and the interaction between the king or the hero or the hero of the story and the ones who deliver this object to him is quite telling, because there is some kind of awesomeness around the maker, but at the same time you laugh at him. And you bind them either with magic, or in the case of Vernon, you actually put him in irons and you cut the tendons from his legs so he cannot move around. So you definitely put this being in some kind of bondage. And quite clearly it's a status marker. You do awesome stuff and you're a really funny fellow.
Yeah. Well, there's this theory that Smiths in the Anglo-Saxon world, in the Germanic world, may have actually been itinerant. So they would travel from place to place, and some of them, there were others that were actually, we know, were slaves. They belonged to people, and so
And
we
also
actually
courtsmiths.
and we actually there are actually documents that talk about how the value of replacing a smith if he's killed. You have to, because he's he's actually property of the
but
elite person.
he's
who
worth
owns
more
it.
than your average.
But he's worth gold.
Yeah, a lot.
But he's still basically a slave.
Yeah, which
But
is
they
how I feel.
but there is this really tantalizing piece of evidence that the very, very few examples of Smith groups of Smith's tools that they found that suggest itineracy also have bells in them.
Exactly.
And there's this piece of law from Britain that says that if you're traveling between countries and you don't make a noise to make yourself be seen, it's lawful for you to be killed as an outlaw.
Because you're sulking, you're sneaking, you might sneak up on someone.
It suggests that itinerant smiths would have had a bell, kind of almost like a leper going along, making noise so that they were, you hear them coming.
I'm not how to sneak up on them.
Well, speaking of bells, I think I have to ring the bell. We're at the top of our artificially constrained hour. I know that we have Peter at 2 o'clock, which is in another hour here in Alaska. I appreciate you guys having me in as your moderator. It's fantastic to hang out with you folks.
Thanks, Sean.
And we'll throw it back to you, Dave, if you'd like to wrap up.
Yeah, no, you did a great job. We're, like we said, we're on again in another hour. It's Peter's presentation where you get to see the dagger of the mother. It is an amazing piece. I think you'll enjoy it quite a lot. And I think you'll be surprised by some of the things you learn. I certainly was. It's fascinating. This rabbit hole goes very deep. So buckle up. See you soon. Thanks.